Please welcome Johanna Walker.
When I was 10, I started orchestrating my wedding. I enlisted my brother to stand in as the groom, and I designed elaborate wedding invitations. I wore a white dress and a veil, and I walked down the aisle, and I fake kissed the groom, and I said I do, and then we bought a house and had children and lived happily ever after, the end. Kathy Glenn, my friend, was my bridesmaid. But she declared that she was not going to get married and she was not going to have children. And I looked at her in dismay. What are you talking about? You're not going to have kids? We're girls. Don't all girls have children? I mean, that's what we do. We have children. And she said no, so we made a bet. We made a bet, and we shook, and I felt like I had a pretty good chance that I was going to win. I was confident I was going to win because all girls have children. That's what they do, and I knew Kathy Glenn was going to end up having kids. My family, we talked about women's lib, right? But Midwestern American, middle-class, white, Protestant sexism dies hard. And in my family, the promised land. Getting married and having babies was the promised land. All good roads led to the promised land. I spent my 20s and 30s trying to unravel that story. And I was a carpenter in New York City, and I cut fish heads in Alaska, and I lived in a yurt in Massachusetts, and I shaved my head and stopped shaving my legs. I made performances, and I danced, and I organized groups to make things happen. And I learned about how to be in relationship, and I learned about how to live well in a body. And I did not get married, and I did not have children. Yet. That was my 20s and 30s. And as I'm approaching 40, I start to think, wow, maybe I'm not gonna have kids. And this was a novel thought. It had never occurred to me with all this paradigm shifting that I was doing, it had never occurred to me that I was not gonna have kids. I figured I would eventually have kids. But here I was approaching 40, and I started to consider maybe I wasn't gonna have kids. I had friends who were parents, who were overwhelmed and under-resourced, and I had a pretty good look at the reality of parenting, and I wasn't sure if that was what I wanted my life to look like. So I considered the possibility, and it was okay. I recognized that there would be some grieving to do, but it was okay. But here's the thing. When I was a kid, what they told me, they said, when you get married and have children of your own, you'll understand. When you get married and have children of your own, that was always the line. It was never if, it was always when. And those kinds of words stick to the bones. So even though I was trying on this other idea, I still knew I was gonna have kids. Of course, because that's what girls do. So I considered the possibility. But here, and okay, so I wanted to, right? There was this little part of me like maybe, but I didn't want to be that 40-year-old woman desperate for kids. She was kind of pathetic. I didn't want to be her. So she put her over there, and I was like, yeah, it's cool. You know, whatever happens. If it happens, great. If I find someone to do it with, great. And if not, there will be some grieving to do, but it'll be cool. I'll be cool. Yeah, it's cool. I'm cool. No problem. Well, sexism is a little bit sneaky that way. You know, it's insidious and slippery, and it gets under our skin when we least expect it. And there it was, And for me, I think that I don't know if any of us can really escape it, but it lands on each one of us a little bit differently. And for me, it was difficult to separate the programming and the expectations that got laid so heavily on me from my authentic desires. And by the time I had finally kind of teased those two things apart, and by the time I had finally proven that indeed it was possible to live a happy life without going down that road, and by the time I could hear the still, small voice that said, maybe I want to have a child, it was too late. So fast forward 10 years, and I'm 50. And I am that woman. I am that 50-year-old woman who didn't have children and wanted to. Ultimately, essentially, I wanted to. And that grieving that I said I was going to have to do, I had no idea. I had no idea what that was actually going to mean. The grieving knocked me over. It knocked me over. I think I can pretty safely say it almost killed me. I can pretty safely say it almost killed me. I was not going to the promised land, and I couldn't tell that there was anywhere else worth going. So here's what happened. I was working at a summer institute for girls on the East Coast, and it was drop-off day. Parents were dropping off their daughters, and it was this big emotional moment. There were tears and hugs and so much love and celebration of this milestone. And there I was, and in my body, the pain of the grief was seething and burning through my body. Because benign as it seemed, I would never take my daughter to summer camp. And I could not bear this pain. That was the day I opened my journal and I decided to write it all down. I remembered the words of Isaac Dinesen, who said, "All suffering can be born when you tell a story about it." So I decided in order to bear this suffering, I needed to tell the story. And I wrote everything down. I wrote every conversation I ever had, every message I ever got, every impulse I followed, every impulse I didn't follow. I wrote down the choices I made, the powerful, womanly choices I made that got me here, to this moment, this body, fully female, this life, this blessed life. I told the story. And at first, I just told it in the chambers of my heart and behind closed doors in circles of trusted friends. Because although 1 in 5 women in this country reach the age of 45 without having a child, the amount of shame and pity and disappointment and judgment that gets pinned on us is enough to keep a woman from wanting to speak that story out loud. But one day I heard a talk by Jodi Day, a London author who speaks about what she calls social infertility and the growing and very powerful demographic of women without children. And when I heard her speak, I felt like I was drinking a long glass of water. What a relief it was to hear her story. And because she spoke, I am speaking right now. And because I am speaking right now, perhaps another woman will choose to speak and tell her story. And that's how it happens. That's how it happens, the undoing. We tell our stories. We say the things we're not supposed to say. And then we open a door for someone else to tell their story. And slowly, slowly, we pull apart the threads. We pull apart the threads of the knot, and we untie the knot that keeps us silent and alone. The oppression cannot survive. It cannot survive when we speak what's true. Now, I'm not here to tell you, if you want to have a baby, you better go out and have one because you're going to regret it if you don't. And I'm not here to tell you, I am so glad I didn't have a kid because what an amazing life I'm having instead. Although I will say I'm having a pretty amazing life. And I will also say that I am about the best auntie that any young person could ever want. But I suspect the grief of not having a child will be with me in some form, always. I think that's how grief goes. It doesn't ever completely go away. But I am here to tell you that because I showed up for that grief with my whole body and heart, because I showed up for that grief with my whole body and heart, I transformed it into something else. And in telling the story of that grief, I've opened the door for someone else to tell hers. Story creates a container in which we can bear what feels unbearable. It helps us find our place in the world. And when we come to the stage and speak our story, we actually get to reframe the story and step into a new version of ourselves. And we get to rewrite the big story of what's possible for women. The big story of women, of who we are and who we get to be. So I call you tonight. I call on you tonight to tell a story. And tell a hard one. Tell the one you've been keeping under wraps. We are Edgewalkers here tonight. So tell the one that takes you to the edge. And I promise you that for someone, it will be a long, cool drink of water.